Little green men from outer space have been kidnapping us and blowing up our landmarks for decades now in movies and TV shows.
Help! Help! They're coming!
It happens so often that we don't even think about it anymore. But it started somewhere, right? So how did we come up with this idea that a bunch of aliens would zap us all into oblivion? This trope is all about how we cope with our fears of real-world adversaries. Let's take a look at how the movies turned those adversaries into aliens, and how those aliens changed as we encountered new kinds of real-world threats.
What is that, cuz? That's an alien, bruv, believe it. And I landed in the wrong place, though, you get me? The wrong place!
In 1897, H.G. Wells took what was already a popular British literary subgenre of invasion stories and substituted the Germans and French with men from Mars. The result was his iconic novel, War of the Worlds. His tale of alien invasion captured the imagination of late 19th century Europe at a time when tensions across the continent threatened to break out into war. Nearly a half-century later, a different Wells, some guy called Orson, capitalized on similar fears with his radio dramatization of the original novel.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man.
When the broadcast aired in 1938, fascism was on the rise in Europe. Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime had just annexed a portion of Czechoslovakia, and the world was on the brink of World War II. This climate of paranoia created the perfect conditions for Orson Welles' broadcast to resonate. In fact, legend has it that some listeners didn't realize the broadcast was fictional and thought Martians had actually invaded Earth. Spoiler alert, they didn't. But a year later, Hitler's army did invade Poland, and the world was plunged into yet another global war.
The leaders of Russia tell us their only concern is the defense of their own nation. Is this so? Or are they ambitious for world conquest?
After World War II ended, a new war began, the Cold War, and along with it, a new enemy for America, the Soviet Union. That nation's nuclear capabilities were an ever-present threat. The doomsday clock was ticking, and Americans were prepping their bomb shelters.
Very simply, a fallout shelter could save your life in a nuclear war.
It's no surprise, then, that the films of the 1950s and 60s tackled the subject of war and invasion, except the communists were replaced by little green men. One such film was 1956's Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
This isn't just an ordinary body, is it?
I never saw one like it. It looks unused.
In the film, alien spores fall from space to create large pods. Those pods produce identical humanoid imposters that replace actual people. The key here is that these aliens don't really look like aliens. They look like your friends or neighbors. Anybody could be one of them.
Suddenly, while you're asleep, they'll absorb your minds, your memories.
It's not hard to read between the lines here. During this same period, Senator Joseph McCarthy's Red Scare had created a climate of paranoia in which anyone was a potential communist and a potential traitor.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it.
Invasion of the Body Snatchers exploited those fears by thinly veiling communists as aliens. The Soviet and atomic threats continued to be cloaked in intergalactic costumes for the next several decades, with films like The Blob, Plan 9 from Outer Space, The Day the Earth Stood Still, and The Thing from Another World. By the 1980s, the threat of nuclear Armageddon still hung over our heads, but critiques of communism as an ideology became less obvious.
Wolverines!
In fact, it was Western-style capitalism that came under attack. Financial deregulation and the neoliberal policies of Ronald Reagan in America and Margaret Thatcher in England created new forms of wealth that were increasingly concentrated in the hands of elites.
You see this watch? Yeah. That watch costs more than your car.
In other words, the 1% as we know it today was starting to take shape. John Carpenter launched a stinging critique of those elites with his 1988 flick, They Live. The film follows the aptly named John Nada, which is Spanish for nothing, a homeless blue-collar worker. When John Nada puts on a pair of sunglasses that he finds in an abandoned church, he discovers something weird.
Look, buddy, I don't want no house today. Either pay for it or put it back.
The finance and media elites running LA are in fact aliens that use their influence to manipulate and control humans via subliminal messaging. The glasses allow Nada to see the real message beneath all the advertising and propaganda. It may be an on-the-nose critique of the ruling class and dominant consumerist ideology under capitalism, but it furthers the foundation of the alien invasion trope. We use it to cope with anxieties of larger threats. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Americans were left without a big scary bad guy, and the notion of an invading military force began to seem like a pretty unlikely scenario. Meanwhile, the economy was actually doing pretty well.
Tonight I stand before you to report that America has created the longest peacetime economic expansion in our history.
There weren't really any big scary threats. Thus, many of the alien invasion films of the 1990s, like Men in Black and Starship Troopers, were played for laughs. Tragedy had become farce.
Did you ever see the movie Casablanca? Same thing, except no Nazis. Oh.
Tim Burton's 1996 film Mars Attacks is the most explicit example of this. The film is a direct homage to many of the alien invasion films of the early Cold War period. Through his satire, Burton points out the absurdity of those earlier alien invasion flicks, thereby also pointing out how absurd it is for us to fear a nuclear war in this new era of peace. Then, on September 11th, 2001, everything changed.
That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
Conservative and complacent America was faced with a strange, new, and violent ideology that would shake the country out of its post-Cold War complacency. In the 2002 film Signs, we see a man who has become similarly complacent. Mel Gibson plays a Midwestern farmer and former priest who has lost his faith. Enter strange alien outsiders who threaten his family. Their intrusion into his world forces him to look within himself and to reaffirm the values that he had cast aside. At the end of the film, Gibson's character is shown to have regained his faith. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, America had to look within itself too. Its safety and its values had been challenged, so Americans doubled down on patriotism. And hey, what's more patriotic than going to war?
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
Americans invaded Afghanistan in 2001 and then Iraq in 2003, setting the stage for H.G. Wells' classic story to reemerge, which it did in 2005 with a remake of War of the Worlds, this time starring Tom Cruise and directed by Steven Spielberg. The chilling thing about the film is that the tripods that emerge from the ground have been buried there for years, unbeknownst to anyone, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Rachel! This hidden threat echoed the paranoia many Americans had about homegrown Islamic extremism and the possibility that underground terrorist cells could be incubating on American soil. Thus, the idea that a violent threat might be literally hiding underground waiting to strike resonated with audiences. And then, after nearly a decade of the so-called war on terror, Americans elected Barack Obama, a man who won the Nobel Peace Prize and then subsequently escalated the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The political climate was changing, and the clear-cut good side, bad side dichotomy came starkly into question. Thus, Neil Blomkamp's allegorical film District 9 flipped the alien invasion genre on its head, painting humans as the real monsters.
We're from MA News. We require your scroll on this eviction notification. Yes, it's eviction notice.
The film is clearly a critique of apartheid in Blomkamp's home country of South Africa, but the alien refugees could stand in for almost any victims of a military power. Modern-day fears and threats also manifest themselves in 2016's Arrival. Warning, there will be some spoilers here. Arrival is the rare alien invasion movie that doesn't end in massive destruction and bloodletting. In Arrival, human communication is the threat, as misinterpretation almost leads to the militaries of the world destroying the benevolent alien ships. In an age where vitriol is spewed in internet comments and Twitter could be quite literally used to start a war, it's not surprising that our fears of unpredictable international communication over the internet is something we're trying to reconcile. And as long as those threats and others like them continue to exist, Hollywood will continue to find new ways to turn those bad guys into weird-looking creatures in big, scary flying machines. And that is how alien invasion became a sci-fi trope. Do you have a favorite alien invasion movie? Let us know in the comments, and be sure to check out SciFiWire.com for all our dispatches from the world of fandom.